It all began on a stormy night when 12-year-old twin sisters, Lily and Lucy, decided to take their golden retriever, Max, out for a short evening walk, despite the heavy clouds rolling in over the sleepy town of Willow Creek. The streetlights flickered as the wind howled and the trees swayed violently, and thunder growled in the distance like some angry beast. The girls lived on the edge of the town, where a narrow dirt path cut into the woods behind their house, a place they often visited during the day but rarely dared to enter at night. Tonight felt different, charged with an uneasy energy neither of them could quite explain, and Max's restless pacing near the door convinced them to let him out before the rain came pouring down. Holding hands and sharing a single umbrella, they followed Max along the winding path, his golden fur glowing faintly under the moonlight that managed to peek through the rolling clouds. Suddenly, a distant crack echoed through the trees, sharp and chilling, a gunshot. Both girls froze instantly, hearts pounding in their chests, exchanging terrified glances without speaking a word. Before they could even process what they'd heard, another sound pierced the silence, a scream. Not loud, but desperate and fading, carried by the wind. Max growled low, ears perked, tail stiff, tugging hard at his leash, as though something deep in his instincts was urging him forward. "Lily, did you hear that?" Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. Lily nodded, tightening her grip on the leash and whispering, "Stay close to me." Together, they stepped off the familiar path, the wet grass brushing against their ankles, their shoes sinking into the damp soil as they followed Max deeper into the woods. The air felt colder now, thicker somehow, and every shadow between the trees seemed to move. Then, just ahead, a faint flicker of light caught Lucy's eye, a small flashlight lying face down in the mud, its beam scattering weakly across the ground. And next to it, they saw him. A man in a police uniform lay slumped against a tree, his chest rising and falling unevenly, his shirt soaked crimson. His hand twitched weakly, reaching toward them as his lips parted, and he whispered, "Please, help." The sight rooted them to the spot, fear locking their limbs in place as thunder rumbled above them. His badge caught the dim light, Officer Daniel Hayes. Max whined softly, nuzzling the man's shoulder as if to reassure him, then suddenly turned his head and growled deep in his throat, staring into the darkness beyond them. Somewhere nearby, faint crunching footsteps on dried leaves receded into the distance. Whoever had done this was still out there, escaping into the night. Lily finally broke free from her paralysis, dropping to her knees beside the wounded officer, while Lucy shakily pulled out her phone, only to see the dreaded no signal mocking her on the screen. Panic clawed at her chest. "What do we do?" she whispered frantically. Lily looked around, breathing hard, her voice steadier than she felt as she said, "We can't leave him here. We need to help him." Officer Hayes' breathing grew, ragged, each inhale sounding like a battle he was losing. Max barked suddenly, sharp and loud, his body tense and ready, and the twins felt the truth settling over them like ice. Someone had shot a cop in these woods, and they were now alone, in the dark, with a dying man and an armed criminal on the loose. The weight of that reality pressed down on them, but neither of them moved back. They didn't run, they didn't scream. Something inside them, maybe instinct, maybe courage, they didn't know they had whispered one thing louder than fear. "Save him." Max's growl deepened, low and guttural, as the damp forest seemed to close in around them, shadows stretching and twisting beneath the flashes of lightning. Lily glanced nervously over her shoulder, sensing movement somewhere in the darkness. while Lucy gripped her phone tightly, refreshing the screen again and again, hoping for even the faintest signal. There was nothing. The storm was building, the sky rumbling louder, the wind whipping through the trees hard enough to make branches snap like brittle bones. Officer Hayes let out a weak, rattling groan as he tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped his lips. "He's still here." That one sentence was enough to send a cold shiver crawling down Lucy's spine. Somewhere out there, the person who had shot this cop was still lurking, watching, maybe waiting. Max suddenly pulled hard on his leash, barking furiously into the distance as if he'd caught a scent. But Lily held on tight, terrified to let him go. "No, Max, stay," she hissed. But he growled, his instincts battling her restraint. The officer tried to lift his trembling hand, pointing weakly in the same direction Max was focused on, his voice breaking with effort. "Go after him." Lucy looked at her sister in shock. "Are you kidding? We can't." But before she could finish, Max yanked his leash free with a sudden, violent twist and bolted into the darkness, barking and snarling. The twins screamed his name, running after him despite every bone in their body screaming at them to stay put. Branches whipped against their faces, rain began to pelt down in heavy drops, and their shoes slipped in the mud as they stumbled through the trees, following the sound of Max's relentless barking. Then, through the shadows, they saw a figure, tall, dressed in dark clothing, a black mask pulled over his face, clutching something glinting under the moonlight. The man spun around, startled by the sudden sound of Max's approach, and raised a bloody knife just as Max lunged at him. The two collided with a snarl and a cry, the masked man stumbling backward as the knife clattered to the ground. Max's teeth sank into the man's sleeve, holding him in place as he thrashed and shouted, "Get off me, mutt!" Lily grabbed Lucy's arm, pulling her behind a tree for cover, her heart hammering so loudly she thought the man might hear it. "We have to help Max," Lucy cried, but Lily shook her head, forcing herself to think. That's when she spotted it. Officer Hayes' walkie-talkie lying on the forest floor, where he had dropped it earlier, faint static hissing through the speaker. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lucy darted back toward the officer, snatched up the device, and pressed the side button with trembling fingers. "Shallow," she shouted into it. "Please, you have to help us." "Officer down. We're in Willow Creek woods, near the old path. There's someone here. He's got a weapon. Please hurry." For a moment only static answered, and then, finally, a deep voice crackled back, calm but firm. "Copy that. Stay where you are. Units en route. Keep him breathing. Do not engage the suspect." But it was too late for that last part. Max was already engaging, and he wasn't backing down. The masked man tried to shove him off, but Max leapt again, knocking him flat on his back. That's when the man reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and metallic. A second knife, smaller but just as deadly. "Max," Lily screamed, fear flooding her chest, but before the blade could strike, Max ducked under his arm and sank his teeth into his wrist, forcing him to drop it with a yelp of pain. The girl scrambled forward, Lucy kicking the knife away with her sneaker, while Lily grabbed Max's collar to hold him back before things escalated further. The man rolled over, groaning, clutching his bleeding wrist, and tried to crawl away, but Max stood over him, growling like a predator guarding its prey. "Stay down," Lucy yelled, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. The man froze, glaring at her through his mask, his chest heaving. Somewhere behind them, Officer Hayes groaned faintly, drawing Lily's attention back to the grim reality, while Max had saved them from the attacker. The officer's time was running out. The walkie-talkie crackled again. "Hold tight. Back up is 3 minutes out." 3 minutes. That sounded like forever. Lily tore off her jacket, pressing it against the officer's wound as hard as she could, whispering, "Hang on, please, hang on." Max remained rooted to his spot, his eyes locked on the subdued attacker, his fur soaked, his body vibrating with adrenaline. The woods were silent now, except for the sound of rain pounding the leaves, the officer's shallow breaths, and the distant wail of approaching sirens. But those 3 minutes would stretch longer than their entire lives. The sirens were still distant, faint echoes carried by the wind, but to Lily and Lucy, they might as well have been a lifetime away as they knelt in the mud beside Officer Hayes. Their trembling hands pressed desperately against his wound too. Slow the relentless bleeding that soaked their clothes and turned the damp forest floor into a dark, sticky mess beneath him. The rain had grown heavier, drumming against the canopy of leaves above before crashing onto their shoulders, plastering their hair to their foreheads, blurring their vision until the world was nothing but shadows, screams, and the suffocating sound of their own pounding hearts. Officer Hayes' breathing was shallow now, uneven and ragged, his skin pale and cold beneath their fingers, and every time his eyelids fluttered shut, panic surged through the girls like lightning. "Stay awake, please, stay awake," Lucy begged, her voice cracking as tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks, while Lily's lips trembled, whispering over and over, "Help is coming, just hold on, help is coming." Max stood a few feet away, drenched and trembling but unyielding, his hackles raised, his growl deep and steady as he kept his unblinking gaze locked on the masked man sprawled in the mud, too terrified to move under the weight of the golden retriever's silent threat. Every time the man twitched, Max's lips curled back to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth, and the low rumble in his throat promised that any attempt to escape would end violently. The attacker glared back, panting heavily, his mask darkened by the rain, his wrist still bleeding where Max's jaws had torn through his flesh. But there was something else in his eyes, now fear. Not just fear of being caught, but fear of Max. Fear of these two 12-year-old girls who had refused to run. Fear of the chaos closing in around him. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie crackled again, loud enough to make Lucy jump. "Unit 7. 2 minutes out. Keep that officer stable. Repeat, 2 minutes. 2 minutes." Lily clenched her teeth, pressing her jacket harder against the wound as Officer Hayes let out a guttural groan, his body twitching slightly beneath her touch. "He's losing too much blood," she cried, looking helplessly at Lucy. "What do we do?" Lucy wiped at her face with her muddy sleeve, forcing herself to breathe as she remembered the first aid lessons their dad had drilled into them on family camping trips. "Pressure, Lily. Just keep the pressure. Don't let go, no matter what," she said, her voice trembling but determined. And together they pushed harder, ignoring the slick warmth soaking through the fabric, ignoring the way their arms screamed with exhaustion, ignoring everything except the desperate need to keep him alive until help arrived. Then, without warning, a rustling came from the trees behind them, fast, heavy footsteps pounding through the wet undergrowth. Lily's head shot up instantly, fear gripping her chest as she thought, for a terrible moment, that there was another attacker. Max erupted into furious barking, spinning toward the sound, ready to defend them all over again. But out of the darkness burst a beam of light, then another and another, until the woods were flooded with flashlights and the shouts of approaching. "Officers, police, drop your weapon. Hands where we can see them." 3 voices yelled in unison, their guns trained immediately on the masked man, who raised his hands weakly in surrender, too exhausted and injured to even try running. 2 officers tackled him swiftly, forcing him face first into the mud before cuffing his wrists behind his back as he screamed curses drowned out by the pounding rain, while a 3rd officer, breathing hard from the sprint, dropped to his knees beside Lily and Lucy. "You girls, you did amazing. Just keep holding pressure. Paramedics are right behind us," he said, his voice low and urgent, his hands already reaching into his vest for gauze and tourniquets. Within seconds, bright red and white lights sliced through the darkness as the ambulance skidded to a halt on the old dirt path. Paramedics spilling out with stretchers and equipment. "Move aside, kids. We've got him," one of them said, gently but firmly, and the twins scrambled back, their small hands shaking as they watched professionals swarm Officer Hayes, cutting open his uniform, inserting 4 lines, applying advanced bandages in movements so quick and precise it made their frantic efforts feel clumsy in comparison. One paramedic glanced up at the nearest officer and barked, "He's got minutes. We need to move now." The girls stumbled backward, clutching each other tightly as the rain continued to pour, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, adrenaline still roaring in their veins, as if the danger hadn't yet passed. Max padded over to them silently, pressing his wet, muddy body against their legs for comfort, his tail low but wagging faintly as if to reassure them that it was over, that they had made it, that Officer Hayes still had a chance. As the paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher, one of them turned to the officer in charge and said, almost in disbelief, "If these kids hadn't done what they did, he'd be gone." The words sank into Lily and Lucy like thunder, leaving them numb and shaking as they watched the stretcher disappear into the flashing lights. The sound of the ambulance doors slamming shut drowned out by the rising wail of its siren as it sped away into the stormy night. The hospital's fluorescent lights glared harshly against the pale walls, but Lily and Lucy barely noticed as they sat on a stiff bench outside the intensive care unit, their soaked clothes clanging uncomfortably to their small frames, hands intertwined so tightly their knuckles were white. Max lay at their feet, his golden fur still damp and matted with mud, his head resting on his paws, eyes fixed protectively on the hallway where paramedics had rushed Officer Hayes just an hour earlier. The storm outside had finally begun to ease, but the storm inside the girls' chests hadn't let up. The masked man had been taken away in a separate squad car, flanked by 6 officers. But whispers in the hallway revealed the shocking truth. He wasn't just some random criminal. His name was Ethan Crowley, a disgraced ex-officer who had been fired for corruption and had spent the last year evading arrest after being linked to a series of armed robberies and assaults. Officer Hayes had been investigating him quietly, off the books, determined to bring him in, but somehow Ethan had discovered his trail tonight and set up an ambush. If Lily, Lucy, and Max hadn't stumbled onto that clearing, Hayes wouldn't have stood a chance. As the twins sat there, processing everything, a sudden commotion down the hallway drew their attention. The doors to the ICU opened, and 2 nurses hurried past, followed by the police chief himself, a tall, broad man with a presence that made even the bustling hospital corridor fall silent. Chief Monroe approached the girls slowly, his heavy boots echoing softly, and crouched in front of them so his stern face was level with theirs. For a long moment, he didn't speak, simply studying their exhausted, frightened expressions before finally saying, his deep voice warm but steady, "You too. You saved one of my best men tonight." Lily swallowed hard, glancing down at Max as if unsure what to say. But Lucy found her voice first, shaky and small. We just did what anyone would do." Monroe shook his head firmly. "No," he said, his tone thick with emotion. "What you did tonight was extraordinary. You faced a dangerous, armed criminal in the dark, saved Officer Hayes' life, and helped us capture someone we've been chasing for months. That's not something anyone could have done." He glanced down at Max, whose tail gave a weak wag, and smiled faintly. "And this boy, he may have just earned himself a badge." Before the twins could respond, a nurse appeared, smiling gently, and said, "Officer Hayes is stable. You can see him now." Relief washed over the girls so hard it brought tears to their eyes as they followed the chief into the ICU. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft hiss of oxygen. But when Hayes saw them step through the door, his cracked lips curved into a faint smile beneath the bruises and bandages. "There they are, my little heroes," he croaked, his voice hoarse but full of warmth. Lily rushed to his bedside, carefully avoiding the 4 lines, while Lucy stood frozen at the foot of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Hayes lifted a trembling hand, and Max padded forward, pressing his nose against the officer's palm with a soft whine. "You saved my life," Hayes whispered, his voice breaking, and the twins both shook their heads quickly. "No, Max saved you," Lucy said softly, wiping her eyes, but Hayes chuckled weakly. "Then I guess I owe all 3 of you." A few hours later, as dawn began to break over Willow Creek, the hospital courtyard was filled with uniformed officers standing in neat rows, their faces solemn but proud. Chief Monroe stepped forward, a small velvet box in his hands, and addressed the crowd, his booming voice carrying over the morning air. "Last night, 2 brave young girls and their dog faced danger head-on. They saved one of our own and helped us put a dangerous man behind bars. Their courage reminds us why we wear these badges and what it means to protect and serve." He turned to Lily and Lucy, who stood nervously side by side in clean clothes loaned by a nurse, Max sitting proudly between them. Opening the box, the chief revealed a gleaming silver medal engraved with the emblem of the Willow Creek Police Department. He knelt down, carefully fastening the medal to Max's collar as the crowd erupted into thunderous applause.